June 13, 1993, began as a normal summer Sunday in Minneapolis. Residents went about their business, unaware that the silence of one apartment building would soon be broken by a horrific discovery. There was an eerie silence in apartment 202 on Pleasant Avenue, too long and unnatural. That all changed around noon, when a maintenance worker, responding to complaints about water leaking into the apartment downstairs, walked up to Ginny Child's door. The shower in her bathroom had been working for several hours. At first he just knocked, but there was no answer. He then used his lockpick and went inside. What he saw exceeded his worst expectations. The Gin's body lay on the floor, surrounded by the traces of a fierce struggle. Blood was everywhere, on the walls, on the furniture, even on the ceiling. Every detail spoke of the killer's rage and the victim's desperate resistance. And the water from the shower continued to pour, mixing with the bloody puddles on the floor. Terrified, the worker recoiled, ran out of the apartment, and immediately called the police. This was just the beginning of one of the most mysterious cases in the history of Minneapolis. Dear viewers, thank you for choosing our video and our channel. We put a lot of effort into making sure you enjoy being with us. Ginny Child was born in 1958 in Minneapolis, Minnesota, into a modest working-class family. From the beginning, her life was defined by the social and economic realities of the Midwest. In the late 1950s and 1960s, Minneapolis was a city in transition, where prosperity in some sectors was balanced by persistent inequality in others. Jeanie grew up in a loving family, but they also had their own problems. Her parents worked long hours to provide for the family, and as one of several siblings, Jeanie learned the values of resilience and survival early on. As a child, Jeanie was described as outgoing, inquisitive, and energetic. She loved music, and could often be found dancing in the living room or singing with her sisters. Despite financial difficulties, the child's family maintained strong ties with the community, meeting frequently at dinner parties, at church, and at neighbors' homes. As a child, Jeanie was an energetic and outgoing child, but as she got older, she became more quiet and reserved. This is not surprising in a situation where economic hardship is limiting educational support and opportunities. By the late 1970s, Jeanie found herself face-to-face with adulthood, without the benefits that many others took for granted. Her parents did not provide her with money, and could not provide her with the same lifestyle as her peers. Therefore, she worked in various low-paid jobs, cleaner in offices, waitress, and sometimes engaged in administrative work. But it was difficult to hold on to a steady job, especially when economic downturns hit local industry. Like many women in her situation, Jeanie began to struggle with housing instability, financial instability, and eventually illicit substance abuse. It was during this time that she turned to sex work, not as a planned career, but as a means of survival in a system that offered few alternatives. It's important to understand the reasons why Jeanie made this choice. This industry in Minneapolis, like in many American cities, flourished in areas where marginalized women often struggle with addiction or poverty. Apartment buildings were in a dilapidated state, maintenance was carried out irregularly, and there was often no security. The apartment in which Jeanie lived reflected these conditions. A small, simple room in a building with high staff turnover and little supervision. And yet, despite these difficult circumstances, Jeanie managed to create a semblance of a home. She embellished her space with small, personal touches, photographs, inexpensive knickknacks, second-hand furniture, creating an environment that, though modest, gave her a sense of ownership and control. Neighbors remembered her as friendly and approachable, often willing to share a cigarette or chat in the hallway. She was known to keep an eye on young women in the building, giving them advice or warning them of dangerous clients. Despite the dangers associated with her work, Jeanie kept in touch with her family. She called her sister regularly, dropping by family gatherings from time to time whenever she could. Friends recalled that she often talked about her desire to change her life, to quit a harmful addiction, leave the street and find a stable job. But dependency, poverty, and systematic neglect have made these dreams incredibly difficult to realize. There wasn't an easy path to recovery or reintegration, especially for the women in her situation. So Jeanie continued to lead the one life she knew, struggling to make ends meet, taking care of herself as best she could. Her personal struggles reflected a broader social dynamic. In the early 1990s, the United States was in the midst of a so-called war on illicit substances, which was characterized by aggressive police control of street crime. But little attention was paid to the underlying social problems that lead to drug use and poverty. Women like Jeanie were often criminalized, stigmatized, and left without a meaningful support system. At that time, Jeanie was 35 years old. She was a very strong but deeply vulnerable woman. It is important to remember that it was determined not only by its difficulties. She was, as her sister later described it, a person with a big heart, someone who always wanted the best, someone who cared about others even when she was struggling. Jeanie's life paints a complex picture of survival and vulnerability. She was a nobody. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend. She laughed and loved. She dreamed and hoped, and she carried with her the scars of a life spent in a merciless world. When Ginny Child first came to light in the media, it largely boiled down to a set of stereotypes about a poor life. But for those who knew her, these labels did not reflect the whole reality. She was a woman with choices, albeit limited by circumstances. Yes, she made a choice, but in conditions where the choice was limited, and the risks were always present. June 13, 1993 began, like many summer Sundays in Minneapolis, restless. The neighbors were busy with their morning chores, but there was only silence outside the door of apartment 202 in the red brick house on Pleasant Avenue. That silence was broken around noon when a maintenance worker, responding to complaints about water seeping through the ceiling into the apartment below, approached Ginny Child's apartment. The shower in her bathroom had been working for several hours. Alarmed, but not yet alarmed, the worker knocked on the door several times. When no one answered, he used his keys to unlock the apartment. What he found inside was unlike anything he had ever encountered. Jeannie's body lay on the floor, surrounded by a scene of shocking violence. Blood covered every object in the apartment, testifying to both the victim's desperate attempts to escape and the killer's movements in space. The shower was still running, mixing with the blood that had seeped into the bathroom tiles and accumulated on the baseboards. The repairman recoiled in horror and immediately called the police. Officers from the Minneapolis Police Department arrived within minutes, cordoned off the scene, and began what has become one of the city's most famous homicide investigations. For the investigators who entered the apartment, the crime scene was unforgettable. Experienced detectives, some of whom have years of experience, later described it as one of the most violent and horrific scenes they had ever encountered. Jeannie suffered dozens of stab wounds. More than 65 were later counted, indicating not only the intent to kill, but also the level of rage that a personal motive suggested. Investigators quickly identified the victim as 35-year-old Ginny Childs, a well-known resident of the building. Police interviewed neighbors, some of whom said they had heard the sounds of a struggle the night before, although none of them had called police at the time. Others mentioned seeing strange men coming and going from Jeannie's apartment in the days leading up to her death. But the descriptions were vague, and there were no obvious suspects. The apartment itself was a mess, not only because of the violence, but also because of Ginny's lifestyle. Traces of use, personal belongings scattered on surfaces, as well as evidence of recent sexual activity were found. Police collected physical evidence, including fingerprints, blood samples, and items containing what they believe is the suspect's DNA. However, despite the abundance of forensic materials, technology was limited at the time. In 1993, DNA testing was still in its early stages, and there was no way to match unknown samples to a national database. Investigators collected evidence, took notes, and hoped that traditional detective work, interviews, informants, street evidence, would lead them to the killer. But as the days turned into weeks, no reliable leads emerged. Jeannie's lifestyle complicated the investigation. Adult workers were often victims of violence, and their cases rarely attracted public attention. Potential witnesses did not dare to testify, fearing retribution or exposure. Moreover, the Minneapolis Police Department struggled with high crime rates and limited resources, forcing investigators to juggle multiple cases at once. However, the murder of the Jeanie haunted the detectives assigned to investigate him. What set him apart was the sheer brutality of the attack. This was not a failed robbery or an accidental act of violence. It was a deliberate, insane murder. investigators believe the killer spent some time in the apartment after the murder, moving, possibly grooming himself, leaving traces that could blend in with those of the dying victim. If you left the shower on, it was either panic or a calculated attempt to destroy evidence. In any case, the crime scene was full of evidence, but without the right tools to handle it, the case came to a standstill. For the Ginny family, the wait was excruciating. They continued to live their lives, knowing that her killer was still at large, that justice had not been served, and that over time the outcome had become even more unlikely. As anniversaries passed, they cherished memories, photos, letters, shared moments, and tried to keep her name alive even as the world moved on. However, as forensic science continued to evolve, so did the techniques that investigators used to find long-dormant leads. Units for investigating unsolved cases have appeared, focused specifically on re-examining old evidence with the help of new tools. And in Minneapolis, the murder of Jeanie Child remained on the list of cases awaiting retrial. The discovery of Jeannie's body in June 1993 marked the beginning of a years-long search for answers. A search that would eventually cross state lines using cutting-edge technology and challenge the limits of what law enforcement could achieve, leaving behind a scene of unimaginable violence and a forever changed family. During the investigation, investigative genealogy was used. This approach, virtually unknown to the public just a few years ago, has now become a watershed moment in solving unsolved cases, bringing hope to situations that have long seemed intractable. Investigative genealogy works by identifying partial genetic matches between DNA from crime scenes and people who have submitted their DNA to public databases. These matches can be distant relatives, or even more distant relatives. But with careful analysis, genealogists can build a family tree that narrows the field of potential suspects. Working with private forensics firms specializing in genetic genealogy, investigators sent a DNA profile to GEDmatch in search of partial matches. The process was painstaking and time-consuming. Genealogists studied potential relatives, studied public records, traced family lines, and gradually built a network of connections. Through this painstaking work, they were able to narrow down their focus to a few people whose genetic profiles indicated a close connection to an unknown suspect. And now, in 2019, nearly 26 years later, the world finally knows the identity of Ginny Child's killer. Jerry Lynn Westrom, a businessman, husband, and father from Minnesota, who has lived in the public eye for decades. Arrested, accused, convicted. One name quickly rose to the top: Jerry Westrom. Westrom had never had a criminal record before, and his DNA was not in any criminal databases. Without the use of genetic genealogy, investigators would not have been able to identify him. But genealogical analysis helped a lot. Investigators placed him in the center of a family tree built on DNA matches, making him the most likely candidate. At this point, however, investigators needed a corroborating sample that would definitively link Westrom's DNA to evidence from the crime scene. This led to one of the highlights of the investigation. Surveillance teams followed Westrom in public, waiting for an opportunity to collect a discarded DNA sample. At a hockey game in Minneapolis, they saw him eating a hot dog, wiping his mouth with a napkin, and throwing the napkin in the trash. This seemingly mundane act gave investigators the breakthrough they needed. The tissue was extracted, tested, and found to match the DNA profile from Ginny Child's apartment. The use of discarded items to collect DNA is a legally complex area, but has been upheld in U.S. courts. Once a person disposes of an item in a public place, they are effectively waiving any reasonable expectation of confidentiality regarding the biological material they have left behind. This legal principle allowed investigators to obtain Westrom's DNA without his knowledge or consent, ensuring that the investigation could continue without his warning. Once the match was confirmed, law enforcement acted quickly. The evidence was compelling, and the risk of evidence slipping away or being destroyed is high. In February 2019, police arrested Westrom at his home, issued a search warrant for his property, and began preparing the case for prosecution. The arrest made national headlines both because of the brutality of the crime and the advanced forensic techniques used to solve it. In the case of Children of the Genie, the use of genetic genealogy has yielded answers that have eluded researchers for more than 2 decades. This connected the dots between the unknown DNA profile and the suspect, who had managed to evade detection for years. And it was a kind of completion for a family that had waited too long for justice. For the Ginny family, the revelation of the killer's identity was both shocking and bittersweet. They were stunned to learn that the person responsible for this had lived so openly, so normally, for so many years. They were grateful to the investigators and scientists who worked tirelessly to see the case through. But they were also reminded of all the lost time, birthdays, anniversaries, moments of mourning that dragged on unanswered. For law enforcement, the case highlighted the importance of perseverance and innovation. Investigators who worked on the case in the 1990s were acquitted, knowing that the evidence they had carefully stored would eventually be used to bring justice to justice. Young detectives newly assigned to the Unsolved Cases Unit saw in the Child's case a model of what can be achieved when science and determination come together. In the courtroom, DNA evidence became the cornerstone of the prosecution. It wasn't the only evidence. There were also footprints, historical records, and patterns of behavior. But genetic coincidence was the element that tied it all together. He turned a number of suspicions into a formal indictment, setting the stage for a subsequent trial. As the trial approached, the community was closely following what was happening. Many have been fascinated by science, intrigued by the idea that a tiny piece of genetic material could stretch over decades to identify a killer. Others were more focused on the human dimension, reflecting on the lives of Ginny's children and the long struggles her family endured. Together, these threads weaved together a deeply modern and deeply human narrative, a story of violence, loss, and ultimately, the search for justice. Jerry Westrum's arrest in February 2019 didn't end the story. In many ways, it marked the beginning of a new chapter that will test the strength of the evidence, the reach of the legal system, and the resilience of a family and community that has waited nearly 26 years to be held accountable. For the Jeanie Child's family, Westrum's arrest was a complex mixture of relief, sadness, and hope. On the one hand, they were grateful that after decades of silence, someone had been identified and blamed. On the other hand, they were painfully aware that no legal outcome could restore what had been lost. Ginny was gone, her life was brutally taken, and nothing that happened in court could bring her back. For them, justice was not about restoration, but about recognition, responsibility, and confidence that the person who killed her would not go unpunished. The trial began almost immediately after Westrum's arrest. The Hennepin County District Attorney's Office filed first- and second-degree murder charges, alleging that Westrum entered Jeannie's apartment on the night of June 13, 1993, and brutally stabbed her to death. They disputed that the DNA evidence left no room for doubt. Westrum's genetic material was found not only on a blanket and objects next to the victim's body, but also mixed with Jeannie's own DNA, indicating direct physical involvement in the crime. From the beginning, Westrum insisted on his innocence. His defense, consisting of experienced criminal defense attorneys, quickly prepared a counterargument. They argued that the presence of his DNA at the crime scene did not prove murder. They speculated that Westrum may have had previous contact with Jeannie unrelated to the night of her death. They drew attention to the lack of direct witness testimony, the lack of physical evidence to identify him at the scene of the crime at the time of the crime, as well as the passage of time, which, in their view, undermined the credibility of other evidence. The prosecution, however, believed that they had irrefutable evidence. In addition to the DNA match, they pointed to bloody footprints found at the crime scene, which forensic examinations showed matched the size and pattern of Westrum's legs. They also drew attention to Westrum's story. Although he had no convictions for violent crimes, investigators found a pattern of behavior that they believed fit the profile of a person capable of extreme violence in certain circumstances. The preparation for the trial was long and difficult. Both parties were involved in extensive pre-trial motions, discussing what evidence would be admissible, what expert testimony would be allowed, and how jurors would be instructed to interpret scientific evidence. These legal maneuvers were decisive because the case relied heavily on forensic evidence. The reliability of the family tree, the interpretation of DNA matches, and the broader question of what constitutes, beyond reasonable doubt, evidence in a case that modern science decides. For decades after the brutal murder of Ginny Child in her Minneapolis apartment, the case remained in limbo, remaining a painful and unsolved chapter in the city's criminal history. Investigators working at the crime scene in June 1993 knew they were dealing with a crime of extraordinary brutality. Jeanie had been stabbed more than 60 times. Her apartment had been left in a state of chaos. Her body was only discovered after a worker reacted to a water leak the next day. Despite collecting biological evidence at the time, the tools available in the 1990s did not offer a clear path to identifying her killer. Years passed, and the case turned into a closed one. From time to time, new detectives were appointed to check this. The evidence was periodically checked and reviewed. But the evidence dried up, witnesses passed or passed away, and the collective memory of the crime faded. For the Jeanie family, each past year has brought new grief and disappointment. A sense that justice may never come, that her name will remain associated not with a clue, but with a painful mystery. By the end of the 2010s, this approach was gaining popularity. High-profile cases that were once considered unsolvable have begun to unravel, sometimes at astonishing speed. Investigators have begun to go back to the decade-old files, sifting through evidence that has been lying in vaults for years, in the hope that science can now provide a breakthrough that cannot be achieved by human search alone. The case of Ginny Child, carefully preserved in the evidence archives, was one such case. Biological material collected at the crime scene in 1993 was preserved, and it was still suitable for extended DNA analysis. Detectives working in partnership with genetic genealogists sent a sample to a public genealogy platform in search of any distant family ties that might arise. The process was painstaking and complex. Genealogists traced family trees, compared genetic markers, examined public records, and narrowed down potential people who might be associated with an unknown DNA profile. Investigators worked meticulously, keeping legal and ethical issues in mind, and were prepared to proceed with caution once they identified a potential suspect. But even as these scientific breakthroughs unfolded, the Ginny family didn't know the details. For them, this case remained persecution, a crime that deprived them of a sister, a daughter, and a friend. A wound that never healed. Each year brought another anniversary, another reflection on the life she could have lived, another reminder of the questions that had gone unanswered for too long. At the same time, legal teams were preparing for what could be a landmark case, anticipating legal battles over the admissibility of genetic genealogy, the integrity of evidence collected decades ago, and broader ethical debates about privacy, consent, and the role of science in criminal justice. Both the prosecution and the defense have been preparing legal strategies, quietly preparing for a confrontation that could redefine what it means to solve an unsolved case in the 19th century. The public remained in the dark about the momentous event. Reporters occasionally returned to Ginny's story in special reports or anniversary articles, but there were no dramatic headlines, no public evidence, and there was no sense that a decision was just around the corner. Even in police circles, only a small group of investigators knew that the breakthrough they had long hoped for could soon become a reality. This was followed by a methodical process of confirming the evidence. Investigators conducted covert surveillance, waited for an opportunity to collect a legally acceptable DNA sample, and painstakingly double-checked their findings. In the background, forensic experts prepared detailed reports, prosecutors wrote legal memoranda, and court staff worked quietly to ensure that every step met the standards of justice. All of this work has led to one defining moment, the culmination of years of disillusionment with research and technological innovation. For the Jeanie family, for the city of Minneapolis, and for law enforcement and forensic experts in general, this was a fateful moment. It was not only the long-awaited exposure of the killer, but also proof that even after decades of silence, justice can still find its voice. Prosecutors, led by experienced murder lawyers, stubbornly resisted. They noted that the U.S. legal system has long considered items discarded in public places, including trash, to be legitimate loot for collection and analysis. They noted that genetic genealogy is increasingly being accepted in courts across the country, including in the high-profile conviction of a Golden State Killer in California. Importantly, they stressed that the definitive DNA match was not obtained by genealogical inference, but by direct laboratory comparison of DNA from the crime scene and biological material from Westrom. The preliminary hearings were exhaustive. expert witnesses were called to explain the principles of genetic genealogy, the chain of evidence, and the protocols that had to be followed to ensure the integrity of the forensic process. The judges reviewed judicial precedents, weighed constitutional concerns, and ultimately ruled that the evidence was admissible. These decisions paved the way for a full-fledged jury trial. The selection of the jury was not easy. Given the high-profile nature of the case and the intense media coverage of the use of genetic genealogy, both the defense and the prosecution worked diligently to identify jurors who could approach the evidence impartially. Potential jurors were asked about their familiarity with DNA evidence, their views on privacy, and their understanding of reasonable doubt. After a thorough check, the jury sat down, and the trial officially began. The accusation began with a simple but powerful narrative. In June 1993, Jerry Westrom brutally murdered Ginny Child in her apartment, leaving behind a chaotic, bloody crime scene. The evidence collected at the time, including biological material, was preserved and eventually matched to Westrom using advanced forensic techniques. The DNA match was presented as the linchpin of the case, supported by corroborating physical evidence, expert testimony, and a chronology of actions. The defense, meanwhile, tried to establish reasonable doubts. They acknowledged that Westrom's DNA was present, but argued that this did not necessarily indicate that he was at the scene of the crime at the time of the murder. They put forward alternative theories. Perhaps Westrom made love by mutual consent to Jeanie before her death. Perhaps the DNA evidence has been distorted or misinterpreted. Perhaps the focus on forensic evidence blinded investigators to other, more likely suspects. Witnesses included forensic experts, law enforcement officers who worked on the case in the 1990s and 2000s, genetic genealogists, and members of the Ginny family. Each of them was a piece of the puzzle, reconstructing the events of that night, the investigation and the breakthrough that eventually led to Westrom's arrest. One of the key tasks of the prosecution was to translate complex scientific evidence into a language understandable to the jury. DNA evidence, while often considered conclusive, is inherently technical. Prosecutors worked carefully with experts to explain the principles of DNA matching, statistical probabilities, and steps taken to prevent contamination or error. Visual aids, diagrams, and simplified explanations were used to help jurors understand the meaning of evidence without overloading it with jargon. The defense cross-examined these experts, carefully examining the inconsistencies, challenging the assumptions, and emphasizing the novelty of the investigation methods used. They sought to remind jurors that science, despite its power, is not infallible, that every laboratory process has the right to error, and that every research tool, no matter how advanced, must be scrutinized. Throughout the trial, there was considerable tension in the courtroom. Reporters filled the ranks of the press. Family members of both the victim and the accused sat quietly, listening attentively. Public interest was high, fueled by a widespread discussion about genetic privacy and the growing role of DNA in criminal justice. The last arguments unsettled the case. The prosecution called on the jury to consider the weight of the evidence: DNA match, physical evidence, time frame, lack of any credible alternative suspect. They painted a picture of a man who had eluded justice for decades, but was eventually exposed by science. The defense, for its part, challenged the prosecution's version at every step. They interviewed forensic experts, questioning the methods used and identifying the possibility of laboratory error or contamination. They argued that reliance on genetic genealogy raises ethical questions and suggested that the novelty of the method introduces an unacceptable level of uncertainty. They reminded the jury that no one had seen Westrom at the crime scene, no murder weapon had been found, and the crime had remained unsolved for so long precisely because the initial investigation had failed to find concrete evidence. During the trial, the jury listened attentively. They were shown photographs from the crime scene, listened to hours of technical testimony, and listened to emotional statements from survivors of the Ginny family. While the science was compelling, the human factor was no less powerful. Jurors were reminded that at the center of the case was a young woman who had been brutally murdered and a family who had been denied justice for too long. The latter arguments crystallized the rates. The prosecution urged the jury to focus on the weight of the forensic evidence, arguing that the DNA match is conclusive and that Westrom's defense is nothing more than speculation. The defense, by contrast, cautioned against relying too heavily on scientific evidence without corroboration of facts, suggesting that the prosecution was built on probabilities rather than certainty. The jury deliberated for only 2 hours, which is surprisingly short, given the complexity and length of the trial. When they returned with the verdict, a tense silence reigned in the courtroom. The brigadier stood up and pronounced a verdict: guilty of first-degree murder and second-degree murder. For the Ginny family, the verdict was a moment of deep, complex emotion. Of course, there was relief that the man they believed to be the perpetrator of their sister's murder was brought to trial. There was gratitude to the investigators, prosecutors, and forensic experts who worked tirelessly to bring this case to an end. But there was also a sadness, a deep and enduring sadness for the years lost, the missed opportunities, and the lives that had been so cruelly cut short. Jerry Westrom was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, which is the maximum penalty under Minnesota law for first-degree murder. He had been led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, and now his future was determined by the cold, hard walls of the prison cell. This case was a milestone for the legal system, a testament to the power of forensics, the importance of preserving evidence, and the continued commitment of law enforcement to solving even the most complex cases. It underscores the fact that justice, although often delayed, can still prevail. And it gave hope to the families of other victims, reminding them that no matter how many years have passed, the quest for accountability never ends.